Hello and welcome to Jorgy Stripping the Dipping. You are joined by usual co-host AMG DENZ, and I'm pulled out outside in a black Mercedes Benz. But we had Mother's Day that just passed on the weekend, and my mom would always used to say to me that wisdom is knowledge and knowledge is power. And in that sense, our guest today is royalty when it comes to such things. And I feel like, if he was one of my teachers back in school, I would have been getting straight A's and A stars. So a huge shout out to him. And ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce you to our guest today, Bryson Sullivan, our technical F1 guru. How are you doing today, Bryson? How are you feeling?
I'm feeling quite well. Thank you for the kind words about explaining concepts. I'm by no means the greatest engineer or person like that, but I am definitely an enthusiast of this stuff. And if I can help explain some of it, I'm more than happy to do it.
Excellent, and that's what we love to see as well, Bryson, because as we all know, F1's become a very complicated and technical sport over the years, with the emphasis on sustainable fuels, sustainable energies, move to hybrid, different like aerodynamical concepts as well that have been discovered over the years too. Just for those who don't know, because one, if you don't know who Bryson Sullivan is, I think you've been living underneath a rock. But, for those who don't know, to be fair, could you give us a background into what you do and how you got into Formula One?
Yeah, I don't do anything. I talk on the internet sometimes. But no, right now I'm a graduate student in aerospace engineering. I'm a PhD student. I've always been a fan of Formula One for many years as kind of an informal thing. Obviously, it does have a relationship to the direct engineering side, but I hadn't really been tying those two together so much. And then maybe about a year ago or so, I started really getting into the Twitter F1 community and communicating more with people who know so much about this subject and are so enthusiastic about it, and then learning more and more and more about it. And really, I've just been totally enthralled by it. And one of the things that I can do with some engineering background is try to give some context to things that other people might be seeing. Now, of course, the caveat to anything is that there are always things that we don't know. There are always factors that we don't have direct access to. But it is important to give some context to things. And so if I can help do that, I love doing it. I really enjoy how technically savvy the F1 community is, and also how passionate they are. Sometimes it gets the better of us, but that's okay.
Absolutely, and I think you touched on some great points there as well, Bryson. I mean, with your background, it's no kind of irony there that a lot of what you studied is very transferable to what we see in Formula One. And like you mentioned too, it's a great community and a hub for technical innovations and teaching each other about the new design philosophies and concepts that have happened as well. And on that kind of note, then we'll start on the first question, which was pitched by Georgina. We're going to start with the really radical design of Mercedes W13 in relation to its barge boards and side pods. Georgina has done a lot of research, so I'm going to give her a big shout out for this. But just basically summarize the points that she said here. In relation to the barge boards and side pods, it seemed to be an attempt to create outwash and a low down pressure, which would allow efficient airflow from the front to the rear of the car to generate vortices to help seal the underfloor of the car rearward. In terms of theories and concepts, most people would see this as a winning design philosophy. However, in reality, we've kind of seen the Mercedes slightly off where it would normally be. They've been struggling slightly to keep up with the Red Bull and the Ferrari as we've seen so far. Bryson, do you believe that there's any correlation with that and the new kind of take on their side pods? Is there maybe any other explanations you have for their I wouldn't say lack of performance, but why they're not kind of cutting their teeth at the front to say?
No, it's fine to say lack of performance. I think the reality is the performance they have in hand right now that they can deliver is certainly not where we would like them to be. It's not where they would like to be, but that doesn't mean that we know anything about the performance ceiling of the W13 car. It could actually be, and in fact is expected to be, quite a bit higher than it is currently. One of the reasons why it's so low is because they've had to raise the ride height of the car in order to address this porpoising issue, and you lose something like 20% of your floor downforce with like 8 millimeters of travel. It's incredibly sensitive, and you lose a lot of lap time by doing that. So we know there's performance on the table regardless of this particular concept working or not. The question is, how does it kind of work, right? And what's a general idea? I think just to kind of explain this, you have to take one step back and think of why we have side pods in the first place, right? Why do we even have side pods? Why not just, have the regular, normal, thin body work? And the reason is because the engine generates a tremendous amount of heat, and that heat needs to be dissipated, and it needs to be dissipated through radiators and intercoolers for the turbocharger and oil coolers and things for the hybrid system. Those things need to be packaged in a way that they can perform their job effectively, but also not cause a crazy amount of drag for the car, right? Yep. And so the body work around the side pods allows you to do that. It also gives you an opportunity to sort of guide airflow to the diffuser, the top of the diffuser and the rear diffuser, and now the beam wing, which will ultimately help you improve your downforce. There also is a slight, shielding effect that the side pods can give their rear wheels, maybe let them not have as much drag as they might have otherwise. What's interesting about Mercedes' concept is, instead of trying to keep the radiators, kind of close to the side of the side pod, their radiators are recessed into the side pod, sort of sideways, and that's actually what's allowing them to make their body work so thin and to have their side pod so thin. What that will do is it will improve the quantity of clean airflow, making it directly to the back of the car to produce this downforce and make the entire floor potentially work better. The question is, how is that interacting with the floor sensitivity that results in the porpoising? And also there's a question of how is it working the front of the floor? You mentioned outwash previously. And one of the things that the old barge boards were so excellent at is producing a ton of outwash right at the front of the floor, sort of extracting flow out of the side of the floor, and working the floor that hard in the forward part of it, like, significantly improves the downforce of it. What's interesting is that we don't have the old school barge boards anymore, these complicated beasts, these aerodynamic devices, but we do have a guide vanes on the front lip of the floor, and some of them can definitely be used to produce outwash. In fact, all of them do, but the outermost one actually functions like a barge board. The thing is, some teams like Ferrari and Red Bull to a degree, and even McLaren, are actually using the side pod, the front of the side pod, to create outwash in a less efficient way as you would do for the barge boards. Now, the thing is, with Mercedes' floor and the way that they have their side pod set up, it doesn't necessarily work the front of the floor in the same way that those other designs do. It doesn't necessarily produce the same level of outwash there. And in fact, because they're so thin, we no longer can use the side pod to shield the rear tires from potentially high drag, on top of the floor sensitivity issues that I mentioned before. So there's a lot of things to understand there. There's a lot of things to unpack. What I would say to Mercedes fans and others who are just curious, we don't actually know how much performance the W13 has in hand. You can start making statements about how well it's doing in an absolute term once they have the porpoising under control. And once that's done, then we can make a real assessment.
That's so true, Bryson, and also very insightful answer there. I was really intrigued by a lot of the points you touched on there. We will be circling back to a few of them, as you mentioned, the P word. And for those listening, I hope that you guys take your minds out of the gutter, because I was, of course, referring to porpoising. And then also we touched on there, maybe potential upgrade paths that Mercedes could take with this W13. Also, you mentioned McLaren there, and again, no shade thrown to the papaya mango outfit as such, but yeah, we've seen also a couple of McLaren fans throwing a bit of shade at Mercedes, bit of internal conflict there between the customer teams. And the second question I was going to put forward, Bryson, is, and Georgina as well has asked, what do you see is wrong with the McLaren? Because obviously in Bahrain, we saw Lando and Daniel, like obviously trundling at the back. Daniel's just come back from COVID, obviously, so that might have something to do with it. But also a much bigger theme I've been seeing on the internet as well, Bryson, is, a couple of unhappy fans from other teams, Mercedes powered in specific, kind of throwing shade at the Mercedes power unit that's been so glorious over the last couple of years. Is there a correlation with maybe, Mercedes not being as dominant as they were in the past and the other Mercedes customer teams? So you obviously have Williams, Aston Martin, McLaren in there. Is there a correlation maybe with this Mercedes power unit with the E10 fuel? And yeah, would you say that it's too early maybe to make those assumptions, or is there no irony that it's also the Mercedes powers teams that are maybe struggling a bit more at this early phase of the season?
I think after Bahrain, that question could be asked in a much more general sense. After Jeddah, I think there's very clear evidence that there is some issue with the Mercedes power unit. I don't actually think it's to do with the E10 fuel. I know that was certainly a question. All the teams were handling it slightly differently, and it certainly is a good, suspect for power not being there. If you were, not handling the combustion properly, or you haven't optimized it fully, something like that. I don't actually necessarily think that might be what it is. I think it actually, if it is anything, it might actually be on the electrical side. And the reason why I say that is, this is one of the great things about being an F1 fan in the modern era, is that you can kind of get access to information and data that you might not have otherwise. And when we looked at the qualifying laps for Jeddah and looked at the speed traces down the run to, I think it's turn 22, that turn where Mick Schumacher crashed and Charles Leclerc crashed before, in the years
just
previously.
Before like the bridge, right? Like it's almost,
yeah, it's that high speed chicane at the end of a very long straight. So you're very marginal on electrical power at that point in the qualifying lap. What we actually noticed was Mercedes, Aston Martin, and McLaren and Alpine also all experienced a phenomenon we call clipping. And what essentially clipping is when you run out of electrical power at the end of a long straight because you've kind of drained your energy, right? There's not enough braking zones to recharge it, and you're pulling a lot out of it, so you run out of energy. However, Ferrari and Red Bull and others just really didn't quite show that. And in fact, the Williams didn't show it either. And the Williams is powered by Mercedes, and I think the reason why they didn't see it in Williams is because their car appears to have less downforce and therefore less drag than some of the other Mercedes powered cars. And so they actually would not have been, draining the battery quite as quickly as some of the others were, so they didn't experience it. But the short answer to your question is, do I think there could potentially be something going on with Mercedes power unit? Yes, I think that relationship is causal between what's going on with Mercedes and the other teams. However, what I will say is that if it is actually an electrical issue, and again, it's not confirmed to be an issue, this is my reading of information that I've seen. But if there is an issue, it's actually much better to have it on the electrical side than on the combustion side, because there's been much discussion recently of this power unit freeze that will be happening for the next several seasons, that can effectively lock in wherever your engine is, and you may not have an opportunity to improve it. The good thing is the freeze date is actually different for different parts of the engine. So there's the internal combustion engine, there's MGUK, MGUH, energy store, control electronics, all these different components, exhaust, turbochargers, whatever. But it turns out that the MGUK, the control electronics, and the energy store, three of the most critical components in the hybrid system, are actually not frozen yet. And in fact, they won't be frozen until September 1st, I believe. So if it happens to be the case that Mercedes actually does have some sort of systematic issue with their power unit, which again is not confirmed, and we know how strong they've been historically, there may be other explanations for this. But in the event that that's actually correct, they can actually improve it. There actually are improvements that they can make to it to improve their situation before the engine freeze comes in. The only problem with, of course, is that other teams are not standing still. We know that Ferrari, for example, introduced a major hybrid upgrade in the middle of last year. If you guys remember, it was actually their 2022 upgrade that they had brought forward half a year. The reason why that's important is because they will have an entire 12 months essentially of time running that hybrid system before September 1st. And their expectation is to actually introduce a brand new system, a brand new ERS upgrade right before that freeze comes in. So Ferrari could potentially be even stronger after that. So there's definitely work to be done, but it's not as doom and gloom as some people have suggested.
Well, for us Mercedes fans, that is really key. And of course, yeah, we want to know that we have a fighting chance, because it's not over. There's still a lot of races to go. And also, just to caveat a point that you made there as well, Bryson, how easy will it be to upgrade the kind of energy recovery system, the ERS side of things? Is it a case of, making maybe some performance upgrades to help the outright power and speed and sustainability of that component of the engine? Or also, Bryson, what I would have thought as well is when the teams are doing their installation laps, the systems are probably learning the circuit and learning how much energy they can deploy in each sector as well. Is there a way that the engineers can remap that part of the electrical side of things so it maybe deploys more energy in one sector of the track than others?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is this is a multivariable problem, and it certainly is the case that you can choose where to harvest energy, where to deploy it, whether to get the electrical power directly from the battery or to get it from the MGUH and sort of pipe it directly into the engine instead of storing that energy in the battery. There's certainly strategic ways to do that, but the reality is they kind of know this stuff before they ever even get to the circuit. They have very advanced simulation tools, track simulation tools. It's kind of like a digital model of what the car is, how it behaves, how much energy it consumes to accelerate and brake, and how much power is lost due to drag and other things. They already have a pretty good idea of how their car should be dialed in and set up prior to even getting to the track. This is why simulation is so powerful. That being said, the real car is always different from the model of it. One of my favorite quotes is, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And that's kind of an indication that all of them are missing something. And so I definitely think that there are changes that can be made to optimize what system they have for a given track configuration. I also think that the way that teams run their engines is also different between teams. Just because two teams have the same power unit doesn't mean they can run their cars the same way. And the reason why I say that is because teams typically develop their own cooling systems, sometimes their own exhaust systems too, but definitely their own cooling system that's specific to their car, even if they share a power unit with somebody else. So what ends up happening is, if Mercedes proper has a power unit that they can cool very efficiently, they can run their engine a lot harder. Whereas if someone else has a cooling system that's not quite as good at rejecting heat to the environment, they can't run their engine as hard before it breaks. I mean, a good example would be what happened to Daniel Ricciardo in Jeddah, right? His car retired, and it seemed to actually be related to overheating. The same thing for Fernando Alonso. And I think this is actually directly linked to the new aero regulations, believe it or not. Because the new regulations allow cars to follow each other better and get wheel to wheel and overtake each other, what ends up happening is that these on-track battles between drivers last for longer. They last for more corners within the lap, but they also last for more laps. And when you're behind a car in front, it's chucking out, a ton of hot and turbulent air that not only modifies your own aerodynamics of your car, but also the cooling. So I think some of the cars are actually going to start overheating in the races because the on-track battles are so good. They're able to fight for longer. They actually they may need to improve their thermal margin for their cooling systems.
Yeah, and I think it's like you could read my mind, Bryson, because actually, as you were talking about that, was thinking about the epic battle between Alonso and Ocon, obviously two teammates there at Alpine. And no doubt, although Fernando Alonso was the bigger fighter, as he actually got the track position in the end, it was the more steady Ocon which actually made it to the end of the race, because he wasn't really behind Alonso in that hot, turbulent air that you were talking about, that perhaps, moved Alonso's engine out of the operating window and maybe got too hot. So I think great point to mention there as well. And absolutely, I think the teams are going to have to almost revise the way they go to racing and what margin they run, because as we know, obviously the more cooling and more vents that you have on the car, the more drag and less optimal it is. But also, at the same time, you want the reliability, and you only get points if you finish the race. First, you have to finish, as they say. So, very key there. And I guess moving us on to the next question then. On the streets, they say that the code is no snitching, but apparently at McLaren, there's been some rumors that Andrea Seidel could potentially be launching a protest against Ferrari. There's some allegations there that they've been using their partnership with Haas to abuse some of the wind tunnel testing time, and potentially sharing some data in that regard too. And there are some really strict rules on that. So I wasn't quite sure if this is true, but I just wanted to put forward that to you. Do you think that could potentially be true, considering the relationship between Ferrari and Haas? Or do you think it's just irony and probably more the fact that Haas have had a big injection of money over the years for the Eurocali sponsorship, and the fact that they've had more times generally, which has helped them to be more competitive this year?
Yeah, they've definitely had more time and more CFD and wind tunnel allocation than any other team. That's kind of by design. So it's not a surprise to me that they've come up with the concept that's really high impact, right? But it's also not just Andrea Seidel making these claims. There's also Otmar Safnar, not saying explicitly that it was Haas and Ferrari, but heavily implying that could be the case. And I think there's kind of an old saying that, you're not, your car isn't really fast unless it's protested, right? No one was coming after Haas for illegal equipment really last year or the year before. No one seemed to care. They definitely care now, right? Because it's evident that the performance is there, and regardless of what the moral scruples of Andreas Seidel and Otmar Safnar are, the reality of the situation is these are attempts to curtail what they perceive as a new threat. Haas is definitely a new threat to these teams, and as a result, they're being put pressure on. Now, to be clear, it's not just that Haas has a large, they haven't, money available and wind tunnel time available. It's not just that they are buying up a lot of mechanical parts from Ferrari. It's also that they opened a design office in Maranello, and even though it's cordoned off from the Ferrari facility, the fact of the matter is that one of the ways that Ferrari was able to work its way within the budget cap was to sort of siphon off some of its own personnel and have them be employed by Haas. Now, that doesn't mean that actual data is being shared between the teams. And in fact, there's supposed to be strict rules in place to prevent things like that from happening. But people have ideas, right? There's a conceptual spirit that certain engineers have and certain people have, where you can just tell right away. A good analogy would be like a movie director, or someone who does scores for things. What it sounds like. What Hans Zimmer sounds like. What a Christopher Nolan film looks like, type of thing.
Sure.
It's kind of the same thing for engineers, where they have a certain style of doing things. It's certainly not outside of the realm of possibility that similar ideas are hit upon by people who've had similar backgrounds. Now, that being said, the FIA will look into this, right? If claims are being made that information is being improperly shared between teams, they'll stamp it out. But they're already aware of almost everything that every team does. They have all the CAD files. They laser scan the cars at every race to check, legality now using some pretty fancy technology. So I don't believe that there's anything that will come of this effort that will jeopardize the Haas as an operation or the design directions that they've gone in. I think what we're seeing is primarily a consequence of really a strategic, win for them, which is completely sacrificing 2021, taking the Eurocali money and developing a car that's actually competitive. I'm happy for them. It's just that, this is Formula One. So standing still is equivalent to going backwards. Haas might be strong right now, but if they don't continue developing their car, they're going to be at the back of the midfield or the back of the pack by the end of the season. So even if Haas is in a strong position right now, and I maintain that they are in a strong position, they still have a lot of work to do if they want to get big points by the end of the year.
Yeah, and Bryson, man, it's like you can almost see my screen, because every time you end a question, it almost segues onto the next one, because I was going to caveat it and ask you like a double-barreled question in that sense of, do you think that Haas will be able to sustain the performance that they've shown so early on in the season? Because we know that with a lot of teams, Haas kind of remind me right now of how Williams were at the beginning of the hybrid era in 2014, when they had that AMG sauce from obviously Mercedes, and they were able to piggyback on a lot of podiums and a lot of performance benefit in that regard. But they kind of almost got a bit, how can you say, complacent with the development of the car, and it didn't go as far or wasn't able to sustain that challenge over the years. Do you firmly believe that Haas could be able to keep this up for the entire year? One. And I'm going to circle back also in terms of like the new system we have with the wind tunnel time and stuff like that as well. As an American yourself, I'm sure it reminds you of like the NFL kind of combine draft system there. And do you think that that's in like the nature of the sports? Do you think it's good that we're seeing a lot of the smaller teams get maybe the advantage in a sense of that? Or are you kind of more old school in your thought that, at the end of the day, it's the richest and whoever has the most success and most kind of best technicians and the bigger manufacturers like a Mercedes or a Ferrari that should, get equally as much time, and that Formula One is about evolution, so it shouldn't just be that, the smaller teams are given a more fairer playing field in that regard.
So to answer your first question about Haas, it seems like it could be real. Dynasties are rising and falling all the time. And in fact, there are the winds of change are always, causing things to happen that you didn't see coming. Mercedes right now is on the back foot, more so than they've been in the entire hybrid era. Ferrari looks resurgent, and who would have been saying that after 2020? Things can change all the time. A team can go from being in the midfield to being in the front. These things are highly fluid. So yes, it's entirely possible that Haas could keep it going, and as long as they stay away from dodgy sponsors like Rich Energy and Eurocali, they should be okay. Regarding the this cost cap system that we have, it essentially what this is the least offensive version of something that it could be, and that is something that's done to prevent one team from dominating everything until the end of time, with no one having any possible chance of catching up to them because they're just outspending them by millions and millions of dollars. The reason why the sliding scale tends to make sense is because it does tend to make things more interesting, make them a little bit more lively, and it's a much more indirect way of doing some sort of leveling of performance. It's kind of one step removed from another thing they could have done, which is like, success ballast, or like if you win the championship one year, you have to carry more weight the next year or something like that. Like that would really kill the spirit of the engineering and the design of Formula One. Having a cost cap still allows the designers and the engineers and the aero surface modelers and all these people to be just as brilliant as they always are. They just have to be even more brilliant because they have less time to do it, and they have less money available to do it. So I think that's a version of that kind of makes sense. And as you say, it actually echoes things that we do, in the NFL and NBA and Major League Baseball, where the worst teams get access to the best draft picks. They get first call on them, precisely as a way to level the playing field. And again, you could say in principle, okay, that's against the spirit of competition, and et cetera, et cetera. But the thing is, the teams have a say in whether or not they agree to the rules that they are governed by. And they've all kind of bought into this idea that the sport as a whole could benefit from closer fights and more on-track racing. So they seem to be going for it. And I don't really mind it, really. I do think that we should be careful about, the fall of one dynasty in the past and using it as a predictor to try to explain what's going to happen for the future. People look at Ferrari and their fall after 2005 and 2006, and took them a while to really come back as strongly as they seem to have been coming back. And they would use this example from history to say, Mercedes is washed, they're done, they're not really in the fight. And I would just say, the fact of the matter is that at their peaks, Mercedes has done things that Ferrari actually didn't manage to do in terms of number of wins and win percentage and consecutive championships and all these things. So I would say I would never count out Mercedes, not only because of their resourcefulness and tenacity as a team, but I mean, they have the ultimate X factor in Lewis Hamilton, and he can be the difference that makes a difference if you give him a chance.
Absolutely, and I echo your sentiments there as well, and a lot of the points that you've made, and it's so true. You can't count out the big dogs like Mercedes. You can never keep a good man down, so I'm sure Lewis is going to help them develop the car, and obviously you have a hungry George Russell too, that's equally just as excited to try and bring the team back to where it should be. And that actually brings me on to another question. We mentioned the P word earlier, and I know that Georgina would probably strangle me like Homer Simpson does, but so I have to ask it. And I do apologize, Bryson, because you probably answered this question a million times, but I'm going to put it in my own way. So it's around the P word, which of course is porpoising. Could you explain to the listeners what it is exactly? And also, Georgina caveated this question by saying, at tracks like Jeddah, where there were less bumps, it seemed to provoke it less, although you could argue that the Ferrari seemed to be doing it a bit more. We're going to Australia for the next round, which is an older style street circuit, although there have been some modifications to a couple of the corners, and we've also been made aware that there's a fresh track surface that's been laid out on the tarmac. Do you think that that's going to have an effect?
Yeah, so we talk about this dreaded P word, porpoising. I think the reason why we call it that is because it's just easier to say than, coupled aeromechanical pitch heave oscillation. That just doesn't roll off the tongue in the same way that
sexy.
Yeah, in the same way that the porpoising does. And you were asking about exactly what's going on. I think there's been some discussion recently about historical porpoising, which we've kind of seen in the past, and what might be going on in the current cars, which could potentially be slightly different. And what I would say about historical porpoising is, obviously, the cars are creating downforce because it helps them go around the corner faster, and we're relying more on the floor now than we have before. And one of the properties of the floor, because it's so close to the ground, is, I mentioned you can get a lot of downforce by getting close to the ground. If you get too close, you can actually stall the flow underneath the floor. If not completely stall the flow, you can get a massive change in the center of pressure, and that can actually cause the floor to unload, right? And if your suspension is not damped enough or not stiff enough to handle that sort of step change in downforce, the car will rise up again. And of course, by being higher up, that's exactly what got you in the situation in the first place. The flow reattaches, it creates more downforce, and then it sucks you down to the ground again, and then it stalls again. And then you get this oscillating limit cycle that we're calling porpoising at high speed. The reason why we're discussing that historical phenomenon, what might be going on now, is that there seems to be some discussions behind the scenes that it's really more the suspension side of this phenomenon that seems to be more important for the current cars than the aero side. I don't doubt that some of these cars are definitely experiencing flow separation and stall underneath the floor in certain conditions. But the question is that overloading what the suspension is doing? Because in principle, if the suspension can live with it, a stall is not bad actually in a straight line, right? Because this is some fundamental Yeah, that's what I was going to say. This is some fundamental aerodynamic stuff, but the more downforce the car makes, the more drag it creates. Invariably, it's an unavoidable part of aerodynamics is that it will create drag. And if you can stop the car from making downforce, i.e. by stalling the floor, it will reduce the drag and you will have a higher top speed. This was the whole motivation behind the collapsible rear suspension on the Mercedes last year, right? That was the entire idea. Just let it squat on the ground, stall the diffuser, and you can pick up some speed from doing that. The issue is that if the suspension can handle that could be a benefit. But if it can't handle that, the car will oscillate, and that could exactly lead to this porpoising issue. There's a question about bumps, though, right? So there's also kind of an active debate right now about whether or not the bumps are simply making the porpoising worse, as in they can trigger it, by dynamically lowering the ride height and stalling the floor just enough to kick it off. Or the question is it fundamentally caused by it? And I think I'm still more in the camp of the former, which is to say that if you had, even if you had a perfectly level and smooth surface, I think you would look at porpoising regardless of the bumps. However, you could definitely make it worse by having a bumpy circuit. It is true that Albert Park is an old venue. It's been there for many years. Historically, it would be very bumpy. But also, as you said, they've completely redone the track surface. Not only have they redone the track surface, but they've changed the track layout as well. They've widened the circuit in several locations. They've actually removed the turns 9 and 10 chicane. So now that long run down to the fast, left-right chicane of turns 11 and 12, it's going to be even faster this year. Not only will it be even faster, but we know that one of the characteristics of these ground effect cars is that they have more high-speed grip and less low-speed grip, if that kind of makes sense. Yeah. So even if everything was the same, they would still be going faster through that high-speed chicane. And even with that, they're going to have a higher approach speed as well. So I expect it to be, quite the spectacle when we finally get racing in Australia.
Definitely, and it's funny you should mention that, because I was in the sim yesterday just doing some laps, and it's crazy the speeds that the cars previously used to carry through there. I mean, you'd be in 8th, maybe downshift into 7th to get a nose in, and you'd just be on the edge of like what the car could ask from the aerodynamics. So it'd be interesting to see how the drivers approach that corner, whether or not we might see it being taken flat, although I think that might be too optimistic. And also just going back to the other point you mentioned there as well, Bryson, on the bumps and the kind of debate as to whether it's the former or latter. For those who maybe think it's in the latter and it is the bumps that are causing it, which there's arguments to and for that. A couple of weeks ago, we had this other interesting discussion in the community about essentially like an active suspension. So we'd seen something like that with one of the older Williams cars in the early 90s, I think, with Prost being there as well. Do you think maybe, not this year, but maybe in the future, the FIA might consider a system like that, like a standardized active suspension that perhaps changes when and where the bumps are to make the drivability of the cars more comfortable for the drivers?
Yeah, I think one of the things that was kind of lost in the new regulations, people are focused very much on the aerodynamic changes and, the wheel size changing, but we also lost a lot of trick suspension elements as well this year. Things like, mass dampers, inerters, and anything hydraulic has been removed from the suspension system. So now it has to be just, classically sprung suspension. Regular dampers are still there, but not the things we used to have. And that's actually a big potential part of the reason why we're seeing porpoising so much. It's not just relying on the ground effect more, which is more height sensitive, but it's also that the suspension can't seem to live with it, right? Is what the core of the issue is. Regarding active suspension, I mean, look, it seems like the FIA's job is to set a set of regulations, and it's a team's job to design as fast as car as possible within those regulations, right? Now, if it happens that you can avoid porpoising by just running the car higher, then the FIA will say, "Well, just do that." The teams won't do it though, because they want to go faster. That's where we get this problem. Regarding active suspension, I don't think you would necessarily need to introduce it right now to address the porpoising, but I do think it could be a good idea in the future, and that it will pay dividends in 2026 when we have the overhaul engine regulations. One of the key things about that is we're going to lose the MGUH, and the MGUH is a big part of the hybrid system that produces a lot of electrical energy. That's going to be gone because it's incredibly complicated. It's going to be gone for 2026, and therefore, to keep a similar level of performance, they're going to have to rely more on the MGUK, which is just a part of that system that converts braking energy into electrical energy. Well, the problem, of course, is that the MGUK harvests energy off of the rear axle. Right? It's all based on the rear axle, and if you increase the power consumption that you need from the MGUK, it means you're going to be braking the rear axle even more. And so there have been questions raised about stability under braking in 2026. Are these cars going to be incredibly sketchy because they're harvesting so much off of the rear axle? Active suspension could actually make that a lot easier. Not only does it allow you to dynamically change the height of the car as you go along the track, but stiffness and damping and torsional rigidity and all of these things that you can it's an engineer's playground. Active suspension, you can design a system meter by meter along a racetrack to be exactly what it needs to be to maximize performance. So I definitely think that a regulated sanitized version of active suspension could actually be really beneficial down the line. But I don't think it's needed right now for the porpoising.
Sure, and also just for the viewers as well, we touched on the MGUK, MGUH. So motor generator unit, and the K, so for kinetic, Bryson mentioned there, is essentially when the car is recovering lost energy through the brakes and reharvesting it back into the electronical system, the ERS. But also the MGU H, so heat. I'm assuming, Bryson, that's when it's taking wasted heat from the turbo or the engine and basically spooling it back into the turbocharger to create more energy.
Yeah, I feel like there's a better name for that.
Yeah,
the thing is, it doesn't directly convert heat into energy. What it's actually doing is it's taking a motor generator and fixing that to the shafts of the turbocharger. Right. So what ends up happening is the turbo is spinning and it's compressing the air before it gets into the engine. And of course, it's powered by the exhaust gases. Everybody knows that. But what's interesting is that if you put this motor generator on that shaft of the turbocharger, you can artificially load it more than it should be based on the air.
So you get more boost, right?
Well, what I mean is you can put more load on it so that the exhaust gases have to work harder to spin it. Right. Okay. And so you can pull energy off of that and pipe that into the energy store, or you can even put it directly back into the MGUK to make the car go faster immediately. But the reverse of that is exactly what you're describing, which is if the turbo is having difficulty spooling up at low engine RPM, you can take energy from the energy store, or maybe even the MGUK or something, I don't know, or from the energy store, and pipe that directly into the MGUH, and that will mechanically apply additional torque to the turbocharger shaft to speed it up, right? So this is exactly why these new cars are so amazing. They don't have turbo lag. they literally don't have it. They don't have it because where the turbo would normally be lacking because of not enough mass flow rate of the exhaust gases, you can literally mechanically spool it up with the MGUH. And when you're not needing that additional boost, it can run in reverse and actually extract energy out of the exhaust gases that way, effectively making the turbocharger a turbine for you while it's doing its normal function. So it's very, very it's a very, very complex piece of machinery. You guys may know that the smaller you make something that spins, the faster it can spin, before it breaks. Turbochargers, especially at high altitude tracks like Mexico, can get up to like 120,000 RPM.
Jeez.
Just extreme RPM, and that's normally fine for like a shaft and just like blades on a turbocharger. It's not a big deal. But when you put the AMG UH on there, now you have like, coils and like magnets and things that also have to spin at 120,000 RPM, and that is a huge challenge for the engineers. And so it's one of the reasons why they're dropping it for 2026, because it's actually a barrier to entry for other teams that might want to join the sport.
Of course, like Porsche, we've had the Volkswagen Group mention some intrigue as well. And yeah, like you said there, 2 points I was going to add was, it's so cool that we're seeing these innovations from Formula One make their way also into road cars. I remember like hearing that Ferrari essentially designed the first automatic gearbox with the Ferrari in the 90s, which was super cool. And like you mentioned as well, if they can simplify the technology, then we might see the addition of more teams come into the sport, which is what we want to see. So that'd be great. And kind of to bring us into one of my wacky questions of the day, Jorgy's wacky questions, I'm going to call this segment. I wanted to ask you, Bryson, if you were going to build your own F1 team, right? And you had unlimited resources to do wherever you wanted, but
I wish you could see the smile on my face right now.
Yes,
I wish you could see it.
Of course. What are the areas you would focus on? And also kind of the stare of the question I was going to go for here is, who would you employ as your like head of aero/design? Would you go for Adrian Newey, Ross Brawn, or James Allison?
Oh man, Ross is out of the game though. Ross is no longer.
Yeah,
I think actually just to speak about that and who was actually responsible for designing the 2022 regulations, the aero side of it. Certainly, Pat Simmons was a big part of it.
Sure, from Williams as well.
He deserves his own share of credit. He used to work at Renault for several years. As far as who I would want. While it is definitely true that Adrian Newey has an aura about him and a reputation, and his corpus of work certainly speaks for itself. No one is denying that. But personally, I'd like to have a James Allison in my corner. I'd like to have a Mike Elliott. There are a ton of people in the Mercedes camp that I think are not as famous, but are doing excellent work. There are dozens of engineers you've never even heard of that are doing brilliant work that are probably even better people to have involved in your team to get something done. But I think the ethos of the Mercedes team right now, even when it's on the back foot, and perhaps especially because it's on the back foot, is something I would endeavor to replicate in an organization hypothetically that I would make. As far as car development goes, definitely have to fix this bouncing issue with the porpoising, even though Mercedes seems to be dealing with it almost the worst. I mean, certainly the most visibly. They're not actually the worst, but they are definitely suffering from it, and other teams have mostly gotten a handle on it. It still comes up every once in a while. I saw the Red Bull doing it in Jeddah. I saw the Ferrari doing it earlier. So it's something that people are going to have to work on. But once you get past that, I think there's a lot of lap time to be gained in figuring out how to shape the front of the floor and those guide vanes that I mentioned earlier. There's actually quite a lot of design freedom there, almost as much as the side pods themselves. And I think there's potentially a lot of lap time that people haven't quite figured out in terms of what the right concept is. I also think that the performance ceiling of these Venturi tunnel floors, these curved floor cars with ground effect, is significantly higher than the old school flat bottom floors. And so I think that it's not an unreasonable prediction to make that within 1 year or 2 years of pure development, all other things being equal, I think this new generation car will ultimately be faster than the old generation car, and hopefully will still retain the favorable aerodynamic characteristics that allow the cars to race each other better. So those are the things that I would probably most be looking at. I'm sure there's some front wing design things that we kind of have to come to a consensus on. If you remember, Red Bull, for example, and many other teams they have a 4-element front wing that has 4 sections to it, but the first one is not attached to the nose at all. There's sort of a slot gap there, and that's something that Ferrari did not do, and also Mercedes has not done. I think that design and exploring the sort of contours of that concept could actually yield some performance down the line. It's something that I would be looking at, certainly.
Definitely. And also you touched on there as well, like there are so many unsung heroes at like Mercedes in terms of their engine development crew. You mentioned Mike Elliott there as well, and I guess it kind of shows us just how amazing Mercedes have been, because a lot of banter has been happening online where people are saying, "Oh, all of Mercedes engineers and mechanics are going over to Red Bull," but they say Red Bull gives you wings, but apparently it's not giving you much reliability, because there's been a couple of failures there too. And to kind of bring us into one of the questions Georgina wanted to ask is, she asked, did Red Bull really run out of fuel, or was it due to a fuel pump failure in Bahrain? And kind of to double barrel the question as well, you mentioned earlier we've got these new rims, these new tires. Do you think that tire degradation, it's not going to be such a thing compared to previous years? And are we going to see the end of the dark art of the tire whisperers like Sergio Perez and maybe some other drivers that have been able to use that to their assets to win or to succeed in some races?
Yeah, this question about running out of fuel is an interesting one. I think when most people think of fuel, they think of it in one state of nature, which is a liquid, right? Yeah. But the reality of fuel is that it can vaporize, especially at high temperature and low pressure. It's one of the reasons why when an airplane takes on fuel before a flight, they never measure it in liters or some volumetric measurement. They always measure it in weight, in kilograms or in pounds, because that doesn't change even if the phase of matter changes. And sure. I think what actually happened with Red Bull in Bahrain is that, yes, they did run out of fuel, and it wasn't because the pump itself was broken, and it wasn't because they didn't physically have the fuel. What we think the problem was that too high a fraction of it was vaporized at the moment that they needed it. It was vaporized because they were running in dirty air for several laps, and the temperatures were rising not only on the engine side but on the brake side. And it was also vapor because they were running at the very end of the tank, right? So if you have almost nothing in the tank and you're trying to maintain a certain pressure and everything, the more fuel you consume, you have to allow air to vent into the tank. Otherwise it'll suck it, it'll be crushed by the pressure differential. And apparently under the conditions that were there, it just seemed to be a high fraction of vapor. Sometimes you hear about vapor lock, and the pump is just pumping vapor. It's not pumping liquid fuel, and so the engine will starve. So I definitely think that's what happened with those two cars. I believe Pierre had a AMG UK failure that resulted in a fire because of some liquid that was spilled. It's unrelated to what happened to both Red Bull cars. And just to be clear, the power units that Red Bull is using are badged Red Bull power units, but Honda built them, Honda designed them, and Honda is maintaining them. So as far as I'm concerned, those are Honda engines, and it's something that I have to be keeping an eye on. You would think that the engines would be reliable. Honda's been, doing all the things they were doing normally, and they had great reliability last year. The truth is, with the engine freeze looming, teams have been more radical on the things they put on their engines this year, because they know that they can fix reliability later, but they need power now. So that's what they're doing. Regarding the tire performance, I mean, if Bahrain is any indication, and if Jeddah is any indication, even though there are new tire compounds, they certainly aren't a raceable tire for one stop in most situations. I mean, you kind of can, but 2 stops is probably more likely. And I think there is still scope for, tire whisperers like Checo Perez. I would even say Lewis Hamilton is in that group as well. His pace on the hards in Jeddah was really phenomenal, especially considering the woeful state of affairs that made itself known on Saturday, and the car setup was just completely out of the window. The fact that he was able to show that kind of pace on hard tires with that car. Again, you can make minor modifications in park formation, and that's one thing, but it was really impressive. And so I think that currently the way things stand, there's definitely still a room for tire preservation, and these things can change over time. I'm sure Mario Isola is in a meeting right now, a Zoom meeting, trying to figure out what he's going to do with the Pirelli tires. But no, overall, I think it will certainly be entertaining. There's no way to really lose here, because yes, pit stops are part of the strategy that make it kind of interesting as far as watching the race goes. But in terms of the raceability of the new cars, we've seen enough data now to know pretty conclusively that these new regulations are working, that they are allowing the cars to fight each other for more corners of a lap, and indeed for more laps. So I think that however we sort of cut this pie, there's still going to be considerable amount of great racing. So I don't worry about that at all.
Sure, absolutely, and it was so, I was so angry with the camera directors of the Jeddah Grand Prix as well, because whilst it was cool to see Ocon and Alonso battling, and then obviously the battle at the front between Leclerc and Max, they completely missed all of our guys' overtakes as well. Lewis making his way from P16, and a lot of the hard work he's doing on the hard tires, as you mentioned too. And Lewis obviously is no rookie when it comes to managing tires. He just has this innate ability, and experience and wisdom when it comes to
but he's. I want to give Lewis credit for doing work. He was not always this good at tire preservation. I know in the early McLaren days, and even towards the later end, he had excellent race pace and obviously amazing qualifying pace, but sometimes he would drop off a little bit in the races, precisely because he couldn't quite keep the tires in the window. I want to give him credit for seeing that as a potential weakness to his game and addressing it. And precisely as you said, he's gotten to the point where he's really, really in a good situation as far as being able to actually handle tires. This is a little bit silly, but I think it's legitimate. He had a tire fail on him in Silverstone at the end of the race, if you remember.
Yeah.
And it takes a certain amount of skill and feel on the brake pedal to be able to coax a car around with a delaminated tire. In fact, I know the most impressive thing about that victory wasn't that he finished the race with 3 tires. It's that he did an entire cool down lap in the in lap with 3 tires and came back to take his place and go to the podium. He was able to go all the way around the racetrack. That was incredible. So he certainly has elevated his game in that way. I think he ranks up there right with the best of them now, with his level of skill at handling tires.
That's so true. And again, just going back to that 2020 season, Bryson, there are other memories I remember as well. Like, in Turkey, I think that's also another one that people sometimes forget, when the team were telling him, box of the Inters, and he's saying, nah, guys, just leave me to it, Bono. I think I could manage this one. And maybe in his head, like you mentioned as well, his times at McLaren when, let's say China in his rookie year, he had that painful, gut-wrenching moment when he got asked to come into the pits on completely bowed tires, and then he couldn't make that corner. And all of those experiences, they help you to learn and develop as a person, and you've seen him put it in practice time and time again and again. And this is awesome just to see, even with like a last lap moment like that, going back to Silverstone, this is composure and his ability, like you said, to judge distance and speed to bring a car basically with like 3 wheels back home. Because in other instances, we've seen drivers with punctured tires ripping off the floor and like causing more damage to the car, and bodywork flying everywhere. Yeah.
Make no mistake, Lewis Hamilton is one of the greatest drivers of all time, and I think arguably he is the greatest driver. He's certainly statistically the greatest, but I think a very good case could be made for him to actually be the greatest. What I think annoys me about the broad characterization of Lewis is that far too often Lewis does not get credit for things that he actually does, whereas other drivers get credit for things they haven't done, right? So someone will say X driver or Y driver, if you put them in a car like Lewis Hamilton, they'll win 10 championships, they'll do this, they're such a great driver. It's like, well, they didn't do it. Either they put themselves in the wrong team, or they put themselves in a team and didn't didn't stick with it long enough to see it turn around, right? And I think there's a little bit of revisionism in history when people talk about his success, how successful he is, how successful Mercedes is, as if it was just assured, guaranteed, they're just going to win, they're just ahead by miles. The fact of the matter is they have fought viciously for every championship they have, whether we know about it or not. And I think that aspect of it is the reason why actual people who were involved in the sport, Mattia Binotto or, even some other drivers, Sainz and even Verstappen say, don't count out Mercedes, because they know, painfully all too well that how tenacious that team can be, even if fans, new fans and sometimes even old fans forget how hard that team has worked to achieve its success, and they assume that the rumors and everything are right, that they were all good and now they're just bad because they don't know how to fight. It's just not true. And I think if people took a hard look at this, they would understand why you can still have hope for this team to turn it around. Not just on the engineering side, we know there's a lot of time on the table with the W13, but just in the resourcefulness side of the team. It's a very powerful outfit that really just doesn't know how to give up. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing what they'll do.
Definitely, I agree with everything you said there as well, and they cannot be understated, or I don't think anybody should write them off, because you don't win. I don't think in the history of any sport there's been a team that's won 8 consecutive championships back to back. It's unheard of. That's just completely new territory, and they continue to do it year in year out. They continue to re-innovate themselves and try and push themselves. And people forget, like you mentioned, that there have been rule regulation changes. The 2016 cars and 2017 cars are radically different, with much wider tires, much wider body and longer wheelbase cars that we had in 17 when those regulations came in. The W08, which was a bit of a diva and was struggling to find like a perfect performance window, and as the season went by, Mercedes were able to tune that car, and Lewis also, his input and feedback would have no doubt played a huge role in that. So definitely, I think people would be remiss for underplaying Mercedes like that. But then kind of bringing me on to my next question, Bryson. This is more to do with the racing and DRS as such as a tool for racing and overtaking. We saw quite an intriguing battle between Leclerc and Max again. We saw a similar thing in Bahrain, where Leclerc was being quite witty and almost like a matador to Max the bull with the red,
that is a very quality analogy. I really like that.
Thank you. I was thinking about how I could contrast it, but yeah, obviously Leclerc playing mind games with Max in terms of the DRS detection point there. And for myself personally, I thought it was a lot of fun to see that. But you always have the other side of the fan base, which was concerned about maybe it becoming too dangerous in the future. Maybe a driver might just brake very erratically, to try and basically break that DRS detection point cutoff and force the other driver to take it, and then an accident being caused that way. Do you see it as an issue maybe in terms of the way that the rules are at the moment with that? And also in the future, do you believe that F1 might get to a state where maybe we don't need tools like DRS anymore prior to its inception in the sport? Or do you think you'll always be something there to stay?
No, it's definitely possible. The cars are looking a lot better. I can certainly envision a future where we don't have DRS. We're not quite there yet, but it's certainly something that's on the table for future seasons. With regard to the DRS chicken, I'll say that we've been seeing. We saw it a little bit in Bahrain because Charles wasn't even using 8th gear on the main straight in Bahrain. He was trying to get Max to overtake him precisely so he would have DRS on the next straight. Part of that is born by the fact that you have consecutive DRS zones, but you also have consecutive DRS activation points, right? So if you can imagine there was only one DRS activation point, and if you get it for the first one, you guarantee getting it for the second one, you would never see this DRS chicken stuff, because it wouldn't make any sense. In fact, we're going to go to Melbourne next weekend, and that's exactly one track that I can think of with consecutive DRS zones that only has one DRS detection point. So that's already a feature of the specific track configuration. As far as the danger goes, It is potentially dangerous. And in fact, the part of the reason why Lewis and Max came together in Jeddah last year, one of the reasons why Max is going so slowly and Lewis was also not, either getting out of the way because he didn't know what was going on, and also he had more motivation not to get out of the way, is that precisely that they were trying to figure out who would get the DRS first. Right? That's part of the reason why the incident happened. It's not the entire story, but it's part of it. It's possible for the two drivers who are involved in wheel-to-wheel combat to misinterpret each other and have a collision. That's already bad, as we saw in Jeddah last year. But I'm thinking actually more in terms of this year. This particular race had a safety car and a virtual safety car that allowed the field to bunch up at various points in the middle of the race so that when they restarted, the leaders were pretty far away from lapped cars, right? It's unlikely, but it's possible in a future race that there will be 0 safety cars and 0 virtual safety cars. Now, if that happens, there would be a lot of lapped cars, and potentially those lapped cars could be immediately behind the leaders on track when they're doing this DRS chicken stuff at the end of the race, right? Now, that could actually be very dangerous, especially at a track like Jeddah, where there are a fair number of blind corners. So imagine a slightly different permutation to the race that we saw, where there were no safety cars whatsoever. There were some lapped cars, right? And Max and Charles are doing their DRS chicken there and slowing down. They're braking 100 meters before the actual braking point, and they're going so much slower than they should go. Suddenly, a lapped car is coming up behind them at full racing speed, and they don't see them because they're not paying attention or the corner is blind.
Sure.
Right? Then you can have a 100 kilometer per hour or more, 200 kilometer per hour, depending on the difference in speed, collision, car on car. And as I've always said, if you look at some of the most dangerous accidents in recent histories, the ones that have unfortunately resulted in loss of life in F1 specifically, they haven't actually been a result of a car impacting a barrier. The cars are designed very sturdily and stably, and the barriers are designed to be able to catch the cars. The most dangerous type of accident you can have is car on car at high speed, because the cars are pointy and there's stress concentrations, and they're not designed to hit each other beyond the rear impact structure and the nose. And so, yeah, I could potentially see this being a safety issue going forward with DRS chicken. I imagine that the FIA is seeing this as well, and hopefully it doesn't take a bad accident for them to become aware of it. But I imagine that there may be some limitations put on this type of behavior going forward, specifically to improve safety.
Absolutely. And I think in a way you kind of answered the next question I was going to say as well. Like, if the FIA wanted to police this more, I guess what they could do is change the configuration of the track so there's not consecutive DRS zones. So that way, even if one driver was to overtake the other, then if you didn't have the consecutive DRS like one after the other, then you wouldn't be able to like at least pull that kind of move off. So
yeah, and just to be clear, just to be clear, it's not the zone itself that's the problem. It's the second activation point. You can keep the consecutive DRS zones, but just maybe have one activation point at the beginning, and then you automatically get it for both.
Oh, okay, understood. Yeah. So in that kind of sense, whoever was behind on the first one is going to have the advantage of it, I guess, on the second one as well.
Bingo.
If that's great. Yeah. Oh, perfect. Okay. Yeah. I definitely echo your sentiments there as well. And it was a really interesting permutation you mentioned there about maybe a lapped car getting diced up in a situation like that. And with the kind of difference in skill set when we have goats like Lewis Hamilton and then the likes of Latifi at the back of the grid. Honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if something like that happened, but I pray it doesn't. Because we don't like to see fatalities or big accidents like that happen. I think all of our hearts stopped when we saw Mick in a huge accident, obviously in qualifying, but again, you also touched on there how the cars are designed to absorb a lot of impacts in certain ways, and thankfully, when we look at some of the replays on board, we could see him conscious throughout the incident. He was moving his visor straight away, and thankfully it wasn't as severe as we thought it could be. So of course, yeah, I definitely agree with you on that too. And then kind of bringing me on to a hypothetical question, and I wanted to kind of lean more on your technical and engineering background as well, Bryson, here. What is your favorite ever F1 car that we've seen in the sport, and what makes this car so special to you? Because I had in the back of my head the Ferrari F 2004 from like my Schumacher days, and just how brilliant that car was. But then also, I've had just a very sweet spot in my heart for the W11 and the creation of like the dual access system, the DAS, but also socially the black livery that came for that car, and socially what Mercedes stood for and their messaging with that. But going back to you, yeah, what's your favorite car of all time in
F1? It's certainly true that the first F1 car I ever fell in love with was the McLaren MP420 from 2005. That car, it looked unlike any other F1 car at that time, and it kind of sounded unlike any other F1 car at the time, and it was a very distinctive character on the grid. That was certainly my first F1 car that I fell in love with. But I have to be completely honest. I mean, I agree with you that my favorite F1 car is actually the W11, not only because of the technological side, the development, and the just extreme performance that it had, but also because of the messaging behind that livery, right? It's not something that I take lightly. It's very important, and something that I will eternally be proud of Mercedes for doing, and taking the steps to actually do things behind the scenes to actually back up their gestures with action. That's really important to you and me and many other people, but it's something that I certainly took note of. I think the W11 will go down in history, at least for some years, as the fastest Formula One car ever built. It was smashing lap records track after track. The only downside of that car, and this is again a direct consequence of the pandemic, is that we never got a chance to see it at some really amazing tracks. We never got to see it at Coda, never got to see it at Suzuka, and Singapore. There are lap records that could have been broken that weren't. That's probably the only thing I could complain about with the W11.
That's so true. To circle back to the earlier thing you mentioned there as well. Yeah, I mean, I was very, very proud of Mercedes. I've obviously been following them for a while anyways. But for them to kind of take that stance they did with the car, because it's always been known as the silver arrows. Although, ironically enough, another history trip there for the viewers. The Mercedes is not always silver. The Mercedes back in the 50s, when they originally racing, was white. And then even back then, they were looking at, engineering kind of moments of brilliance and kind of science behind cars, and they noticed that the car was overweight. So what they did back then was they stripped off some of the paint, so it revealed the raw chassis, and that was a silver car. So that's where they got the name Silver Arrows. But bringing it back to the 21st century and modern, social kind of things happening around the world, yeah, Mercedes have obviously been somewhat of a conservative company. They tend not really to get their nose involved in too many social things happening, but for them to take that stance, and with us having the most successful driver of all time, let alone a black Formula One driver, and what was happening at that time, I think was huge and very commendable of them to do that with delivery. And then also Bryson talked about there as well, just unfortunately the car didn't maybe go to some of the most legendary circuits that we see, and you mentioned Kota there, which is so high speed, and then Suzuka, which Lewis has always gone quite well at, like statistically, and just it's an awesome circuit. You've got 130R, you've got so many high speed corners where that sort of car and that configuration would have been brilliant. And my caveat question on this, Bryson, kind of bringing it back to it, is what is an F1 innovation that you really were moved or inspired by that got banned, and what would you bring back that's been banned by the FAA or stuff like that?
I think we already have turbos back, so that's already a good thing. In fact, the turbos now are better than they ever have been because of the anti-lag and stuff that we talked about. We have, in a way, we have active aero back in the sense with DRS, right? It's a very sanitized and very specific version of active aero, but technically it's active aero. I think the thing that needs to come back actually is active suspension. And as I said before, it doesn't necessarily need to come back in an unregulated way, in the way that it was before, that would require huge outlays of investment from the teams, and it would spark an entirely different arms race if it was totally unregulated. But I do think a semi-standardized version of it, or at least a version that's designed within a specific regulation set, would actually be really beneficial. As I mentioned before, we talked about the porpoising issue. It could be potentially helpful for that, but as I also said, it could really help out some things with the change in engine regulations in 2026. So I would probably bring back active suspension.
That's a pretty cool shout, and I was thinking about active suspension too when I was drafting up these questions. The blown diffuser came into the back of my head as well, but then I think one of the drawbacks of the blown diffuser was that it wasn't really fuel efficient, and obviously with F1 moving to more sustainable fuel, trying to basically get more MPG, and essentially being more efficient with the fuels, maybe something like that. I don't feel would return.
Yeah, we actually, there's another reason why we can't do it, and that's because we have the turbocharger now. The exhaust exits up like really high, in the middle of the rear wing structure, like by the main wing and stuff. It actually, like, it's just like
too far away to get.
Yeah, where it's located, you actually can't do blown diffuser in the same way that we did before anyway. So that's another reason why we couldn't quite do
Of course, with those limitations too. That's true. And again, it's so awesome, and I'm really thankful, Bryson, that we've had you on today, because it's nice to have fans that have the perspectives and understanding of as well as how these rules and how these innovations they work, and they're all unique. And maybe something that was around, let's say in 2009 up to a certain period, like you've identified there, it wouldn't be applicable. It just couldn't work technically with the kind of generation of cars we have now, and that's always a sign of how quickly things are moving forward and how like great the sport is in terms of that way. It really is like mechanical, like engineering brilliance in that sense. And kind of bringing us towards the tail end of this podcast, we ask this question to everybody on the show, but what are your top 3 predictions for the Australia finishing positions? And also there's been some rumors, it might not necessarily be in time for Australia, but Mercedes have not Mercedes, but maybe people have been teasing the fact that Mercedes have a new floor package that could potentially drop at any point, I guess. What would be the improvement benefits of this? And do you think that there's anything else that we might see in Australia?
I'll go in reverse order. My understanding is that there was a new floor that was intended to potentially be ready for Australia, but it's not ready. And it didn't make the flight, is what my understanding is. That being said, I think there are changes that'll be ready for Australia. They're going to be incremental changes made at every race. They're going to happen in Australia, they're going to happen at Imola, they're going to happen at Barcelona. Every single time we get closer to the European season, there will be changes and there will be modifications made. I mentioned before that that porpoising is an aeroelastic problem. It's like an aeromechanical problem. Therefore, there's solutions on the mechanical side, like modifying the suspension, but there can also be solutions on the aero side. Those aero solutions can be coming up with a floor that's not as flexible, that maybe doesn't bend as much and have that kind of a problem with flow separation at high speed potentially. Or it could just be one that has a different characteristic as far as like how the center of pressure changes forward and rearwards when the car is at different attitudes, and even that could maybe help the porpoising issue. So there's a number of ways on the aerodynamic side to kind of improve the problem. As far as the the finishing order, I'm going to say that Lewis wins and Verstappen second and Leclerc third, only because I'm an optimist.
Hey, well, we love optimism and we love positivity, and like we always say, it's nothing ever stays solid in F1. I think you said it perfectly. Just like, if you stay still in Formula One, you essentially go back. And yeah, we're expecting Mercedes to just continue making these incremental changes. Of course, there's still like a period of understanding, and we're always learning. So that's always quite key. And I'd love to see something like that too, because it would just show that even in this early stage that there's no outright kind of like jockey ahead of the field, and that every team and every track has its own quirks and characteristics that might suit certain teams more than others. So I would love your prediction there to be the reality, and we shall see very soon. But as we wrap this show up, Bryson, I just wanted to ask, just like, what are your final thoughts for the season ahead of us? And also, Bryson, I just want to take this opportunity to just say thank you immensely for taking your time to be on this episode. Honestly, it's just been a golden episode. I think people are going to be taking nuggets of, and I'm not talking about those McDonald's nuggets either. I'm talking about, this 5-star nuggets of information just from everything that you mentioned. You have such a succinct and such a clear way of explaining the very technical and very tricky elements of the sport that some people might not understand. And yeah, where can we find you? Are you doing anything that we should be looking forward to soon? And yeah, like I said earlier, like our final thoughts on the season ahead and your expectations.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on. I always, when I have an opportunity to talk about F1, I love to do it. And I also enjoyed this conversation. It seemed like there are a lot of things that we hit upon that are going to have relevance not only for Australia but for the entire rest of the season. So I'm glad to come here. I don't have anything to plug. I'm not really ambitious enough to be doing anything. There's nothing coming. I'm just talking into the ether, but I enjoy doing it, so that's why I'm doing it. Regarding the season, what I want is not even from a sporting side. I understand that the new regulations are really have been effective, and I expect to see some very entertaining races. What I want for Formula One in 2022 is to really demonstrate that it is ready to occupy the world stage, which it aspires to do. It needs to do that in terms of how it treats the people involved in the sport, in terms of making sure that the calendar for next year isn't crazy with so many races that mechanics are having problems, doing stuff. And also, I feel like what happened at the end of last year was so egregious, and the sport has done everything in its power to make sure it'll never happen to anyone else ever again, type of stuff. But of course, Lewis has had to pay the price for their education. And what I think is, even though Lewis tells me and tells us he'd never expected an apology from the FIA, I think he deserves one. I think that even though a report was released, a quote-unquote report was released, I think the FIA can do more in giving us information about what happened previously and just acknowledging the fact that as a direct consequence of their actions, not just Michael Massey's actions, because really the stewards had an opportunity to change the result and didn't. I would like more information on understanding what they plan to do in the future, but also just acknowledging the reality of what happened, that it wasn't business as usual. And if they can do that, I'll feel much better about things.
That's a very powerful note for us to land on, Bryson. And I definitely, and I'm sure the viewers, and well, I say viewers, listeners at home will definitely be taking that in and echo that sentiment, because I feel that we were robbed and injustice was committed. And like you said, they haven't really paid the piper. They haven't really been sincere in the way that they handled the matter even after the fact. And it leaves a huge marker really against the integrity of the sport, the FIA, the FOM, Liberty Media in the messaging that they're bringing out to us as the fans, the way that they handle controversial circumstances like this. And it's sad because, like you said, I think the biggest person to really pay for their lack of due diligence and their ignorance and negligence in that case was Lewis. And I think that's super unfair to him, considering that he did no wrong in that scenario, and they haven't really done much to make good of it. But it's something that I think all of us are going to remember. And yeah, just we can only look onwards and upwards. We can only kind of continue to put the pressure on them. And I know that your voice was very prominent amongst all of us, in that movement and campaign towards December and even the early months of 2022, when we were still campaigning for answers and a reasonable response from the FIA in relation to those things. So I think you've hit the nail on the head. And Bryson, honestly, we have to have you again. I hope that we can have you again, later on in the season, because you've been one of the best guests I've had the pleasure of interviewing. You're so knowledgeable and insightful with the kind of information that you have, and I'm so thankful that you want to share that with us, because knowledge is so powerful. And as I said earlier, in the great words of my mom, Sharon Clark, Wisdom is knowledge, and knowledge is power. And I'm so glad that we have royalty on the show today. Make sure you follow Bryson at the Natural Perigium on
Paradigm, natural paradigm.
Sorry, Natural Paradigm. My apologies for my pronunciation there as well. But I'm sure Georgina, when she chops this episode up, she'll put the at as well on Spotify and all our other mediums as well. But Bryson, thanks a million for having you on, man.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks.
Excellent. And for those at home, thank you as always for tuning in. Make sure that you leave a review. Make sure that you share with all your friends and families on the relative social media platforms too. And yeah, this has been another episode of Georgina Stripping the Dipping. It's your boy AMG DENZ, and we are out. Thank you as always.